On December 17, 2010, a 26-year-old street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi doused himself in petrol and set himself alight in the Tunisian city of Sidi Bouazid. After 18 days in a coma, from which he would never emerge, Bouazizi died of his injuries just 4 days into 2011. His death sent reverberations throughout Tunisia, which soon spread out across the entire Arab world. Over the next 6 months, more than 100 Tunisians, mostly poor young men from rural areas, followed in Bouazizi's footsteps by setting themselves alight. The outcry in response to Bouazizi's death led to the Tunisian Revolution, as tens of thousands of Tunisian protesters took to the streets, demanding greater political freedoms, working conditions, and an end to corruption. Within 10 days of Bouazizi's death, Tunisia's president of 23 years, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, was ousted, and his government was overthrown. In 2014, Tunisia held the nation's first free and fair presidential elections since gaining independence in 1956, as Beji Caid Essebsi was elected president with just over 55% of the vote. Things are by no means perfect in Tunisia now, to put it mildly. The country's economy has been crippled by austerity and the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. But Tunisia is now ranked as the freest Arab nation on earth by the Freedom in the World Index. Inspired by the Tunisian Revolution, there were similar uprisings across North Africa and in the Middle East. In total, 19 countries throughout the region experienced protests of one kind or another in what would become known as the Arab Spring, with a legacy that makes Mohamed Bouazizi's suicide one of the most significant events not just to have taken place in the so-called Arab world, but in the entire world since the turn of the millennium. Many of you will be familiar with some of the consequences of the Arab Spring at the beginning of the 2010s, whether that be the rise of ISIS, a coup in Egypt, or the ongoing civil wars and humanitarian disasters that we see in Libya, Yemen, and Syria. Less talked about, in Western media in particular, for reasons that we will come to later on, was the protest movement in Bahrain, which is the smallest nation in the region by both size and population. But in today's video, we are going to talk about Bahrain. Why the people of Bahrain are so angry, why events and circumstances in Bahrain should outrage all of us, and, most importantly of all, in the context of this video at least, why a Bahraini international footballer was arrested, fled the country, and continued to be hunted down by the powers that be in Bahrain, who chased him from Australia to Thailand and declared him as an internationally wanted fugitive. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Bahrain, a flat and arid archipelago in the Persian Gulf where protesters are silenced, dissidents are disposed of, and even footballers aren't safe, as we take a look at the trials and tribulations of Hakeem al-Araibi. Bahrain is a tiny country which is made up of a series of islands, the largest of which is Bahrain Island, and most of which are connected by a series of large, interlocking road bridges. Situated in between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Bahrain is also connected to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by the enormous 25-kilometre long King Fahd Causeway, which was opened in 1986 and was named after Saudi Arabia's ruling monarch at the time. Despite Bahrain's small size and population, less than 1/100th of the size of the United Kingdom and with fewer inhabitants than West Yorkshire, the country embarked upon a golden era in football at the beginning of the 2000s. Bahrain reached the Interconfederation playoffs in their bid to qualify for the 2006 World Cup in Germany, where they were narrowly beaten by Trinidad and Tobago, and they repeated the feat in 2010 World Cup qualifying, coming even closer this time around, before a missed penalty paved the way for New Zealand to qualify ahead of them. It was into this exciting generational team in Bahrain that Hakeem al-Araibi emerged at the start of the 2010s. Spotted in 2009 whilst playing for his local team in Bahrain's capital city of Manama as a 15-year-old, al-Araibi's talent left an immediate impression on scouts. He was invited to train within the national team setup by the Bahrain Football Association, or the BFA, and a year later, he made his international debut for Bahrain's under-17 team. al-Araibi also joined the youth team at Al-Shabab, who competed in the top flight of Bahraini football at the time. A centre-back who could also deputise at right-back, al-Araibi was tall, strong in the tackle, and considered to be a talented defender with a bright future in the game, who could add to the qualities of the burgeoning Bahrain national team. The Bahrain national team, like a number of national football teams and sports teams, has often been viewed as a unifying force within the country. Around 70% of the population of Bahrain are Muslim, though this figure climbs to 99.8% when it comes to Bahraini citizens, removing foreign workers and residents, mostly from other Arab countries. A majority of Bahraini citizens are adherents of Shia Islam, meanwhile Bahrain's ruling royal family, known as the House of Khalifa, are Sunnis. The royal family claim that Bahrain is split roughly half and half in terms of Sunni and Shia Muslims, but all of the available evidence suggests otherwise. Most international estimates put the Shia majority in Bahrain at around 70%, with more conservative estimates dropping as low as 62%, but still a significant majority. Many of Bahrain's football teams are designated as being either Sunni or Shia teams. Al-Shabaab, for example, who al-Araibi played for, were considered to be a Shia club, and al-Araibi himself is a Shia Muslim. However, with the Bahrain national team, there were no religious or political distinctions drawn between players. Until 2011 that was. Bahrain has been ruled by the House of Khalifa for more than 150 years. For most of that time, Bahrain's royal family ruled the kingdom as an absolute monarchy, with no parliament or elected politicians. In the 1990s, there were 5 years of uprisings as leftists, liberals, and Islamists joined forces to demand democratic reform. State-sanctioned put-downs failed to deter the protesters, but in 1999, Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa became the new Emir of Bahrain, promising reforms and a referendum on the National Action Charter. The National Action Charter would see Bahrain become a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy, and in a 2001 referendum, 98.41% of the population voted in favour of the charter, with voter turnout at over 90%. It seemed as though Bahrain could become a model of democratisation within the Middle East, but a decade later, the people of Bahrain were not impressed. The National Action Charter had heralded the creation of a parliament in Bahrain, but opponents of the House of Khalifa claim that it is little more than a puppet parliament created to give the illusion of democracy in a country with a human rights record which has been described as being dismal by Human Rights Watch. In fact, as far as most people could tell, the only definitive reform that had emerged out of the National Action Charter was that Sheikh Khalifa was no longer Bahrain's emir, now he was their king. But the people of Bahrain, or a considerable number of them at least, no longer wanted to be subjects. They wanted to be citizens. So when Mohammed Bouazizi set himself alight, Tunisia ridded itself of the shackles of President Ben Ali, and protests spread out across the Arab world, Bahrain was ripe for unrest. What was remarkable about Bahrain's protest movement was its size, diversity, and how peaceful it was. All factors which have been roundly denied by the House of Khalifa. These protests were far larger than the ones that Bahrain had experienced in the 1990s, but they would also be far shorter, and they would be met with a far more aggressive response. The protesters had a long list of seemingly not particularly unreasonable demands, which included genuine democratisation, free speech and press freedoms, and an end to discrimination against Bahrain's majority Shia population. Whilst protesting in of itself is not banned outright in Bahrain, there are extremely draconian restrictions on the number of people who can protest, what they are allowed to protest against, and where they are allowed to carry out those protests. The House of Khalifa used all of these justifications and more in an attempt to very swiftly and violently end the protests. On just the fourth day of protests in Manama, Bahraini security forces carried out a nighttime raid to clear the Pearl roundabout of protesters. They did so in a brutal and chilling fashion. The tents and temporary accommodation of the protesters was engulfed in tear gas as security forces attacked even journalists covering the raid and doctors seeking to help those who had been wounded. Shots were fired at protesters who refused to disperse. In total, more than 300 protesters were injured and 4 were killed. Rather than frightening their opponents into submission as intended though, what became known as Bloody Thursday only led to further anger on the streets of Bahrain. Many protesters no longer wished to engage in dialogue with the king, they wanted him gone. Riots echoed out across Manama from Pearl Roundabout, which became the epicenter of Bahrain's uprisings, as it became clear that no deceptive national charter was going to resolve this conflict. Police and security forces eventually withdrew from Pearl Roundabout, chased away by protesters who were armed only with flowers, and all of this happened within the space of a month. A number of high-profile Bahraini citizens joined the protests, including some of the nation's star footballers. Al-Araibi, a trained paramedic and also Bahrain's all-time leading goalscorer at the time, was arrested and allegedly tortured for his involvement, rumoured to have taken part in the protests and to have provided medical assistance to those who had been hurt. 3 other Bahrain internationals were also arrested and allegedly tortured. Al-Shabaab, the team who Hakeem al-Araibi played for, were actually shut down due to their supposed involvement in the uprising and, most likely, due to them being considered a Shia club. They would later be allowed to resume playing again after a year without playing any football, though they were forced to drop down into Bahrain's second division. The uprising ended not with the people of Bahrain being granted democracy, free speech, or greater human rights, but with the government of Bahrain asking Saudi Arabia to come to their aid. It is easy to forget that Saudi Arabia, as it is now, ruled by the House of Saud, has only actually been in existence for less than 100 years. Ever since the Iranian Revolution at the end of the 1970s, which overthrew Iran's ruling dynasty, which had ruled Iran for 7 years longer than the House of Saud had ruled Saudi Arabia at the time, Saudi Arabia's royals have been terrified about the prospect of being overthrown by any kind of popular uprising. Tunisia is not as close to home for Saudi Arabia as Iran is, but the Tunisian revolution still sent shockwaves throughout the House of Saud, and the unrest in Yemen and Bahrain, right on their own doorstep, seemed to present a mortal threat to their totalitarian rule. Bahrain and Saudi Arabia's ruling royals also share good relations, on account of the House of Khalifa being largely subservient to the Saudis and both being of a Sunni persuasion. The Gulf Cooperation Council, which is nominally supposed to be a trading bloc made up of 6 Western Asian monarchies, agreed to send troops and equipment to support Bahrain's failing crackdown. 1,000 Saudi troops and 500 soldiers from the United Arab Emirates did just that, in an unprecedented act given the fact that Bahrain faced no external threat, just internal pressure. The support of the Gulf Council in suppressing pro-democracy protesters in Bahrain was criticised by the European Union and the United States, but not in any meaningful sense. Both the EU, UK, and the US view Bahrain as an important buffer to Iran, and have therefore been very slow, if not entirely absent, in their critique of Bahrain's numerous human rights violations. The United States and the United Kingdom both said they condemned Bahrain's use of violence in 2011, but neither of them would suggest that the House of Khalifa's rule was illegitimate, nor would they even implement sanctions in an effort to pressure them. The United Kingdom, standing as a bastion of freedom, democracy and fairness, briefly paused arms sales to Bahrain before resuming them. The Taktika armoured vehicles that Saudi troops rode into Bahrain on were supplied by the United Kingdom, who once formally and now tacitly support both regimes, along with a number of others in the region. Once the protests, in their most vocal form, had been put down, Bahrain's security forces quickly turned their attention to reprisals, and no participant would be deemed too big or too famous to prosecute. Several footballers were allegedly beaten, tortured, threatened, and imprisoned. Hakeem al-Araibi spoke out about their treatment and asked football's authorities to do more about it. There was just one particular problem, in Bahrain at least, with that request. The Bahrain Football Association, or BFA, was led by Salman bin Ibrahim al-Khalifa, who, as his surname suggests, is a member of the al-Khalifa ruling family. Indeed, just about every sporting institution and body in Bahrain is headed up by one royal or another. Sheikh Salman was not only president of the BFA from 2002 to 2013, he then became president of the Asian Football Confederation, and he finished second to Gianni Infantino in FIFA's 2016 presidential elections. Having to go through an election process must have seemed rather insulting to him. al-Araibi had already been on the radar of security forces in Bahrain before his comments about mistreated footballers. His brother Ahmad, who is currently imprisoned in Bahrain, was known to authorities as an activist before the 2011 uprising. Once, when police had visited al-Araibi's home during the night to arrest Ahmad and he wasn't there, they arrested him instead and held him for 3 months. It is worth noting that al-Araibi was still only 18 at the time, so it is little wonder that he held animosity towards them. On his 19th birthday, in November 2012, al-Araibi was arrested by Bahraini security forces, accused of vandalizing a police station 4 days earlier. Al-Araibi seemed to have a fairly solid alibi that he had been playing in a televised football match at the time that the alleged crime took place, but apparently that wouldn't suffice. According to al-Araibi, during the 45 days that he was held, security forces beat him, spending 3 hours hitting him hard in his legs. The men, al-Araibi claims, knew who he was and what he did for a living, and taunted him by stating, "We will break your bones, we will destroy your future, you will never play football again with these legs." After being released on bail pending his trial, al-Araibi was called up to Bahrain's senior team for the first time in 2013. After a game against Qatar, the teenager fled to Iran, Malaysia, and Thailand before settling in Australia, where he sought asylum. After 3 years living in Melbourne, the Australian government accepted al-Araibi's asylum application and he was granted refugee status. A year later, in November 2018, al-Araibi flew with his wife to Thailand for a belated honeymoon celebration. Unbeknownst to them, a week earlier, Bahrain had issued a red notice for his arrest, which is the highest priority notice, with Interpol, the international organisation that facilitates worldwide police cooperation. Interpol has been criticised in the past for expanding the tentacles of despotic and human rights abusing regimes by granting them permission to put out bogus arrest warrants for dissidents and protesters. As such, in 2015, Interpol banned countries from putting out notices for individuals who had been granted refugee status by the countries that they had sought refuge from. Of course, that ought to have made al-Araibi immune from arrest by authorities and immune from any Interpol notices being put out at Bahrain's request, but whilst Australian Federal Police in Bangkok had alerted Thai authorities that al-Araibi was due to arrive in the country, they allegedly failed to notify them that he was a refugee who had fled Bahrain in 2013, though the AFP deny that allegation. Although the Interpol red notice against al-Araibi was dropped 3 days after he arrived in Bangkok, when his situation had been documented, Thai authorities refused to release him. Instead, they separated him from his wife and transferred him to Bangkok Remand Prison pending a trial. At his trial, almost 2 months later, which received international media attention, al-Araibi begged the court not to send him back to Bahrain, but they appeared to be unmoved. The Thai Attorney General's office ruled that Bahrain had a legitimate criminal case against him and gave him 60 days to appeal their decision before being deported. Thailand doesn't actually have an extradition treaty with Bahrain, but that doesn't mean that extradition requests can't be made, and Bahrain seem to be determined to put their former international behind bars. Al-Araibi feared that he would be tortured and perhaps even killed were he deported to Bahrain. He had been an outspoken critic of King Hamad and the ruling regime during his time in Australia, and particularly the nation's footballing authorities. His comments about Sheikh Salman when the Bahraini royal ran to be FIFA president had brought great scrutiny over not only Salman's presidential bid, but Bahrain's treatment of footballers and sports people more broadly, which Western media had largely overlooked at the time due, one suspects, in no small part, to the fact that Bahrain is considered an ally of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union, as I alluded to earlier on. Al-Araibi once again appealed to footballing authorities to put pressure, this time on the government of Thailand, to release him. Eventually, he would get his wish, but support would come from the bottom up rather than from the top down, as campaigning by football fans and fellow players, including the likes of Didier Drogba and Jamie Vardy on social media, led to FIFA taking a firm stance in favour of the former international, and Australia's Scott Morrison being forced to take an interest in his case. Following a huge effort from the likes of former Socceroos captain Craig Foster, numerous human rights lawyers and activists, and almost 1 million people using the Save Hakeem hashtag on Twitter, in February 2019, the Thai Office of the Attorney General finally dropped their case against al-Araibi, and he was allowed to return to Australia. The Attorney General's office cited Section 21 of the Prosecution Act as justification for dropping the case, which stipulates that the state may do so if the case isn't deemed to be in the public interest. In essence, the public pressure and support from the world of football for al-Araibi had forced their hand. Other dissidents and refugees, without his public profile, may have been less fortunate. Despite Bahrain's treatment of sports people and footballers during the 2011 uprising, sports governing bodies have done next to nothing to try and pressure them into better behaviour. And despite their numerous human rights abuses and violent crackdowns on peaceful protesters, Western governments have watched on with equal ambivalence. Bahrain is actually of very little strategic or economic importance to the West these days. Its oil reserves are negligible in comparison to that of its much larger neighbours, and its sovereign wealth is insignificant in relation to the likes of Qatar and the UAE, never mind Saudi Arabia. However, Bahrain's geography means that it is of symbolic importance. If the House of Khalifa is overthrown and democracy prevails, that could threaten stability in the region. It would terrify the other Gulf Council nations, and it would put capital at risk. Because of this, the people of Bahrain must suffer, and suffer in silence. In July 2020, the Kingdom of Bahrain acquired a 20% investment in Paris FC. Neighbouring PSG are owned outright by Qatar's sovereign wealth fund. Meanwhile, both Manchester City and now Newcastle United are owned by Gulf states or Gulf state monarchs, and football in its entirety has become increasingly dependent on money flowing into it from despots in the region. The 2021-22 Spanish Super Cup, which will likely have just concluded by the time this video comes out, is set in the Saudi Arabian capital of Riyadh, for reasons that cannot be explained by football and only by capital. This year's FIFA World Cup will be hosted solely by Qatar, a country of fewer than 3 million people that has never previously qualified for a World Cup. Meanwhile, the following tournament is being jointly hosted by the United States, Mexico and Canada, 3 countries that are home to more than 500 million people between them. Again, the reason for that cannot be explained by football alone, only by politics, capital and corruption. Hakeem al-Araibi still lives in Melbourne, where he plays part-time for semi-professional Pascoe Vale FC in the NPL Victoria 2 League. He is currently in the process of taking legal action against the Australian government for negligence and a breach of duty of care relating to his 77 days imprisoned in Thailand. That is it for today's video. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video. I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.